We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. In the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the Trump White House has accelerated the campaign to suppress dissent, shut down free speech rights, and impose a new form of political governance inside the country. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're joined by Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an organizer, he's an author. He is also the host of the Freedom Side Live, which you can see every Thursday on Breakthrough News. Eugene, welcome back.
Brian, thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you. I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk with us. The political efforts by the Trump administration, as I said in the introduction, to shut down free speech, suppress dissent, and impose a kind of right-wing political dictatorship in the United States, it's in full swing. They've taken advantage of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. They had that giant funeral, which was partly like a state funeral, partly like a Trump campaign rally in Arizona. There's been the executive order now signed by Trump defining so-called Antifa as a major terrorist organization. There's a lot to talk about. I want to start first, Eugene, with a clip from Carolyn Leavitt. She is the White House press secretary, and then I want to get your thoughts.
Well, Antifa is going to be designated a domestic terrorist organization. The president intends to sign that executive order very soon as it's drafted, as soon as today, later this afternoon. And this is something the president campaigned on because we have seen a rise in violence perpetuated by Antifa radical people across this country who subscribe to this group.
Eugene, not only is that a false presentation, but I thought it was interesting. She said this is something the president campaigned on. Well, that would have been in 2024, well before the Charlie Kirk assassination, showing that this isn't simply a response to a political murder. It's part of the right-wing agenda. Go ahead.
No, I'm glad you pointed that out, Brian, because this is obviously pretextual. And of course, Trump was campaigning on all of these issues. He was stating directly during the entire course of his campaign that he was going to essentially carry out unconstitutional crackdowns on his political opponents. I mean, every rally he was saying we're going to root out the socialists and the communists and the radicals and whatever other, negative things he would often append on there, the people who are, quote unquote, destroying our country. But he was saying very openly and very directly that he felt that the overall powers of the executive branch should be used against people strictly for their political views. He didn't say we're going to go after people who are breaking the law. He said we're going to go after people who have particular types of ideological viewpoints. And I think that this has been, very consistent throughout the entirety of even going back to Trump's first campaign and going back to the point of Trump's first presidency as well, that he has consistently targeted people based on their political viewpoint, which of course is unconstitutional. And I think there are many other examples of this, but I think that I'm glad you pointed that out because that sort of, well, maybe it wasn't a slip up. I don't know what was going on with the press secretary there, but certainly it speaks to the reality of what's going on. It's not about the killing of Charlie Kirk. It's not about any particular protest against immigration. It's not about any of the individual issues, but the Trump sort of administration and the Trump movement, the so-called MAGA movement, just looks for whatever pretext they can find to push forward this general agenda. And you can see it in their broader conversation and their broader discussion in the social media discourse, in the books they write, and all these other things that, just about everything in terms of their political opponents, as they deem them, is designed to attack people for their point of view, not for any particular crime or instance of criminality, many of which they struggle to really point to exact things or make extremely tenuous connections to that are, at best tenuous, oftentimes fanciful, and all the time extremely hypocritical.
Well, speaking directly to your point, Eugene, Stephen Miller, who is this important ideologue, deputy chief of staff of the Trump White House, he's very explicit about this. They want to use all of the different laws or powers that the executive branch could aggregate to itself regardless of specific instances of criminality, in order to shut down their political opponents. And in the aftermath of the killing of Charlie Kirk, Stephen Miller couldn't be more explicit. Here's another clip.
And we are going to do that under President Trump's leadership. I don't care how. It could be a RICO charge, a conspiracy charge, conspiracy against the United States, insurrection, but we are going to do what it takes to dismantle the organizations and the entities that are fomenting riots, that are doxing, that are trying to inspire terrorism, and that are committing acts of wanton violence. It has to stop. And my message is to all of the domestic terrorists in this country spreading this evil hate, you want us to live in fear? We will not live in fear, but you will live in exile, because the power of law enforcement under President Trump's leadership will be used to find you, will be used to take away your money, take away your power.
I mean, it's so obvious, Eugene, when he says we're going to use RICO, that's racketeering charges, or conspiracy, or insurrection. It doesn't matter what the law is. We're going to find some law that we can use to take you down. Now, this violates basic democratic rights. In order to be arrested, there has to be probable cause that you as an individual have committed a specific crime. The government can't say, well, we're going to use this law or this law or this law, whatever law we need to use in order to find you and hunt you down. I mean, outside of the fact that there's a complete falsity about this presentation, this narrative that the United States is being racked by massive riots organized by the terrorist left, outside of all of that, this complete abrogation of basic democratic rights, including bourgeois democratic rights, is a sign of where they really, really want to go.
No, I think that's very true. I mean, they are trying to connect political ideas and political speech to crime in and of itself. That just saying something or even thinking something, but certainly advocating it in a general sense, in a peaceful sense, in a discourse sense, in an educational sense, that all of that would then have to be criminalized. That's what they want. And that, historically is what, people who are of this ilk, this type of sort of far right, ultra capitalist reality in the United States have always promoted, is attempts to protect I mean, if you look at the agenda of the MAGA movement, which is really the agenda of the ultra right, I mean, you have what they're actually doing, $1 trillion of transfers of wealth to the richest people, the destruction of all trade unions if they can get to that, things that are really sort of gimmicks like no tax on tips and no tax on overtime that are actually designed to drive down people's wages and force them to rely on more unstable, chaotic forms of income, and especially in the terms of the minimum wage, to be able to pay people below the minimum wage by placing them at the tipped minimum wage, to eliminate all regulations around the environment, to legalize things like corporate bribery to help corporations aggrandize themselves at no matter what laws that they are breaking. I mean, we could go on and on and on in terms of the anti-working class nature of the Trump agenda, but this type of ultra-right, super pro-capitalist agenda, these sorts of forces, whether we're talking about McCarthyism, where we're talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, and that's relevant. I mean, you got Stephen Miller talking about the Insurrection Act, which was really established in this country to facilitate the crushing and the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Native Americans and popular uprisings amongst workers and poor farmers. I mean, that is the agenda of what is being pushed forward here by these individuals in the wake of World War II to make the world safe for the American century, including this country. You have McCarthyism that's designed to destroy anyone who is against sort of rank corporate profiteering, who feels that the Jim Crow South should be broken up, that feels that unions should have some level of significant empowerment in this country. That's what McCarthyism was really all about. COINTELPRO, of course, cracking down on a movement that had uprisen in this country out of the civil rights and moved on to many different things, from consumer rights to being against the Vietnam War. I mean, these types of crackdowns are always directly and 100% linked to the agenda of the ultra elite richest people in this country who are trying to push very malign policies that aren't actually that popular. And so the only way to do that is to make it very difficult for people to be able to organize people peacefully in legal ways to oppose these things through the various mechanisms that they have. Like, that's what they're really afraid of, is that these things will prove so unpopular that it won't be like an insurrection that they really have to suppress. It'll just be people on an everyday basis who are demonstrating and protesting. And so to order to prevent those sorts of things from happening, people doing strikes, people doing protests, people having political candidacies that can check their power, even if it's just in small ways, they have to shut people up. They have to stop you from saying it. And this has been very consistent when we look at the context of all of these crackdowns over history, going back, of course, to the Alien and Sedition Acts. I mentioned the John Adams administration when they were worried about the impact of the French Revolution. In Reconstruction, when they were worried about the impact of democratic rights in the South, and there was a facilitation of drowning it in blood. In the 1880s, where there's massive crackdowns on the labor movement in this country, including people should look up the Molly Maguires, and they just turned over the courts to the coal companies to execute people just for wanting to organize a right to unions. The first Red Scare after World War I, the second Red Scare during McCarthyism, COINTELPRO. These all are about shutting people up, stopping people from organizing basic in a democratic way to vote, to petition, to demonstrate, all these things. Like, this is not suppression of some massive insurrection the way they're trying to make it seem, some violent revolution. When you look at all these crackdowns, they're about suppressing people exercising their actual democratic and constitutional rights to speak out, and muzzling them so that that individuals cannot organize their peers, their colleagues, and their loved ones in the country to pursue these various means that at least ostensibly you have the right to do so in the country. So it's really about shutting people up. That's what this is about. And that's why Stephen Miller is saying we don't actually care what law it is. We're just going to manufacture something. Whatever law we have to use, however we have to stretch the truth, whatever we have to manufacture, people we don't like, as we heard in the first clip from Carolyn Levitt, something the president campaigned on, the people we don't like, we are going to find a way to shut you up so that you cannot the people will not be allowed to exercise their basic constitutional democratic rights. That is dangerous to these individuals, no matter what lip service they pay. It's not just radical revolutionary uprisings they're afraid of. They're afraid of the broad masses of people exercising the rights that are written down in the Constitution and that have been defended by the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and other progressive movements through time, defended and expanded.
Well, Carolyn Levitt, in that initial clip we said the president's going to sign an executive order even as of today, and indeed he did sign it later that day. It's very interesting what the executive order says. It says Antifa is a terrorist organization. Now, there is no Antifa. I think a lot of people now know that. This is just, not an organization. There's not like an Antifa headquarters where they were reading the executive order. So in that way, it's kind of another fiction. It's just another kind of branding to say we're going to prioritize the suppression of people who are fighting for racial justice, fighting against racism, whatever. I want to read a little bit to you, Eugene, and for our audience about the explainer that the White House issued adjacent to the executive order, because it's very revealing about what the real plan is here. I'm going to read these words. Antifa terror is part of the radical left violence that has permeated the nation in recent years, incited by constant lies and vicious attacks against Republicans from unhinged Democrat politicians, well-funded leftist organizations, and their allies in the media. In 2020, leftists rioted in cities across the country in response to George Floyd. Well, actually, it was in response to the cold-blooded murder of George Floyd, and it wasn't a riot, Eugene. It was 35 million people in the biggest mass protest in the country's history. But again, the rendition by the White House is that it was just a giant riot. And then it ends with these words. This is a time that demands fearless and courageous leadership, not moral cowardice, indecision, or the lack of fortitude to call this what it is, an epidemic of radical left violence. Now, not only is there no Antifa, Eugene, there is no such thing as a domestic terrorism charge. That does not exist in American law. There are foreign terrorist organizations that have been so labeled, most of them falsely, by the State Department, but there is no domestic terrorism. So what I think we're seeing here, and I want to get your take on this, is the Trump administration telling the Justice Department and the FBI and law enforcement, what are your priorities? And your priorities are not to stop, quote, crime. Your priorities are to suppress the people that the president has identified as his adversaries. And it not only includes the radical left, like socialists like ourselves, it includes Democratic politicians, open society, meaning the George Soros funded NGOs, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. In other words, bourgeois liberal organizations and the left all being sort of tied together in this narrative that there is this extreme violent uprising taking place. And again, by labeling the protests in the summer of 2020 as an indicator of who their targets are, that means anyone who fights against police violence or the epidemic of police murder against Black Americans.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it goes back to the phrase I keep using. It's pretextual. And, you know, the way you can really know that is, I mean, I think you're 100% right. I mean, the entire presentation of what took place in 2020 and others is so blinkered. But let's just say that was all true. If the issue was that you wanted to stop political violence in the country, why did they then pardon all the people from January 6th that tried to rush the Capitol, did in fact storm the Capitol of the United States in an attempt to actually prevent the election from being certified, i.e. to sort of abrogate the democratic process in the United States to prevent a transfer of power in the context of an election for the very first time, I think since the Civil War. I mean, you know, if someone wants to fact check me, but it's been a long time. And as you could, the clip that was just shown there, the people hanging the noose, you had the people who were going in there armed. You had groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys that were openly preparing for armed action in the context of this, and, you know, making statements about the possibility of civil war type scenarios, and, you know, having, you know, so-called strike forces positioned in other parts of the DC metro area to come in and wage some sort of violent armed struggle to beat people, including Capitol police officers, the Capitol police officers, at least, that were not facilitating them coming into the Capitol, which is something that, of course, the Democrats didn't look into at all. But, like, you know, you would go after those people. I mean, this is someone, Trump, by the way, who in the Unite the Right demonstration, which was obviously designed to create and to perpetrate violence that was directly targeted at Black people, potentially primarily, but also immigrants and Jews. And Trump says, well, there are good people on both sides. I mean, he accepted the assistance of groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and his campaigns in a different context like that, even in the space where, you know, they were going around and attacking people on the streets. And that is not to add into the border vigilantes and the others that they have openly brought into the sort of broader coalition of Trump, the so-called Trump movement. So, you know, even if everything they said was true, it actually would still be, it would be completely hypocritical that they're only looking at one side. And I say that just to say that it shows you that it's pretextual. If it was really about political violence, if it was really about all these other things, then you would not be pardoning huge numbers of people who had tried to rush the Capitol in a very violent, you know, some might say insurrectionary type event designed to abrogate the democratic process, such as it is written down in the Constitution, whatever else we can say about the Constitution. So again, it's just the pretextual nature of all of this is so clear. And it goes back to what you said about how it's such a broad group of people that they're going after. I mean, we can go back to something like Project 2025. And essentially what the sort of broader MAGA Trump movement, whatever they want to call themselves, is saying, in my view, is if you are not one of the like 100 Republican right-wing think tanks or organizations or whatever under Project 2025, or you don't agree with those views, then you are in fact the enemy, and you are in fact a radical Antifa terrorist. Like, it actually has nothing to do with anything that you have done, anything that you will do, anything you're thinking about doing, anything you've funded, anything you've said. It's basically just anyone who doesn't agree with this ultra-right, ultra-capitalist, extremely narrow view of the United States and the world and how it should be run by an extremely elite group of people. And just to note here, by the way, since we're talking about this crackdown, we mentioned McCarthyism. You know, the head of the Heritage Foundation, who of course was the sort of quarterback, if you will, of Project 2025, he himself has said, and not that long ago, that he thought that Joe McCarthy was right. And he actually said, especially in hindsight. So the opposite of what most people think about McCarthyism is that hindsight has made it seem less justified than it seemed at the time. And a lot of kind of soft defenders of McCarthy are like, oh, you know, Looking back, he made some mistakes, but at the time, you couldn't have known. But in fact, the head, I believe Kevin Roberts is his name, of the Heritage Foundation, the quarterback of Project 2025, actually thinks that in hindsight, it is more justified that we had McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare and everything that came along with it, which was the vast targeting of progressive political movements for their point of view, not for anything they had done. And we could go so deep on all of these different things. I mean, you think about Local 22 of the Tobacco Workers Union in North Carolina, which was 10,000 mainly female Black workers who not only had organized for the very first time this very tough industry of making cigarettes, essentially, but they also were breaking down the Jim Crow segregationist bloc inside of North Carolina, responsible for the first Black city council person in Winston-Salem. Well, they were destroyed by McCarthyism. People like Paul Robeson destroyed by McCarthyism. Major unions like the United Electrical Workers that, certainly were not leading any insurrection, but just said that they thought that there should be things like fair employment practices for women and for minorities on the job, that they felt that wages should actually provide for people's basic living standards, that the government should spend more money building houses instead of trying to find a way to build up a military-industrial complex. They were destroyed by McCarthyism. The Civil Rights Congress, of course, which was the number one organization at that time, waging crusading Scottsboro-type campaigns against frame-ups like Rosalie Ingram, who defended herself against a racist trying to rape her, against the Martinsville Seven, against the Trenton Seven and others who were facing legal lynchings for things that they did not do. They were destroyed by McCarthyism. The International Workers' Order, which was just a large benevolent organization of mainly Jewish people, but also African Americans who were not able to buy in to many of these insurance schemes that existed at the time because of racism, where people pooled their money so they could have basic health insurance, basic life insurance, basic other forms of insurance, just a social order. Just a social order of working class people organized through the unions, also destroyed through McCarthyism. So this is what, in hindsight, the head of Project 2025, essentially the quarterback of it, says is justified about McCarthyism. So you can see in the context of what they're trying to do here that all of this is just totally pretextual, that they're trying to create an environment that falsely links the idea that there's terrorism and violence to any person who is an opponent of their extreme pro-capitalist, extreme right-wing agenda. It's not about violence. It's not about killing. It's not about anything. They're just throwing a lot of stuff out there. They're creating a whole cloud around all these things and saying any progressive person who doesn't agree with this Project 2025 ultra-capitalist, ultra-right agenda is a part of this sort of amorphous cloud of evil, bad, violent, terroristic things that are happening. And they throw so much at you, they don't want you to be able to prove it. It's just like McCarthyism, where many of the claims that were made were totally falsified and completely fake and often proven to be such. And even some of the people who testified in front of those hearings would later admit that they lied about many things. But you just create such a huge, fear around the whole thing that people lose sight of the truth and the falsehoods. They lose sight of what's really going on, and it allows you to cast a very wide net around a very large number of people. But what this is about, and to go back to the point I was making before after the Stephen Miller clip, it's to shut people up. It's to recognize that these types of policies, these ultra-right, anti-worker, ultra-pro-capitalist, ultra-pro-billionaire, ultra-pro-enrichment of the Trump family through crypto deals and other corruption type policies are not popular, and that you don't actually need an insurrectionary, revolutionary uprising to stop that in the most basic sense. What you really need is for people to demonstrate, to protest, to petition, to strike, to wage elections. All these things can stop this agenda insofar. It can't stop capitalism. It can't necessarily mean that you're going to make a major transformation of the entire social order through an election, because the Democrats don't want that either. But it does mean that their agenda is so narrow and so unpopular that basic democratic rights that people have under the Constitution to carry out political activity in order to push forward their views inside of the structures of the system are enough to derail this program, because it's such a narrow, unpopular, negative, anti-working class program that only benefits such a few people. So you have to shut people up. Just like McCarthyism was targeting people because they were just exercising their right to organize unions and to fight for civil rights. Just like they were in COINTELPRO and the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was also part of it during the 1960s, trying to stop the civil rights movement. They want to shut people up to stop them from organizing the people to exercise their basic democratic rights, because these policies are so unpopular and so narrow that even in the confines of the system, they can be easily derailed by popular opposition. So you have to shut people up, and they're using the pretext the fake pretext of linking people to violence to cast a broad net in order to shut people up, to make sure that people can't use their basic rights to overturn this elite narrow agenda.
I really appreciate that framing, and it speaks directly to everyone who believes in justice, fights for justice, wants a better world. Don't be intimidated. Don't engage in self-censorship. Don't go into the shadows. Stand up. Fight back. I mean, as you said, these are unpopular policies, and they can be overturned. They can be stopped. They will be stopped, I believe.
And can I add something, Brian?
Pardon me?
Can I add something, if you don't mind?
Yeah, go, please.
I think the point about not self-censoring, I think, is so important, because the reason why the country has accepted a very broad definition of free speech is people do believe that, I think the broad mass of people in the United States, that what democracy means is you should be able to advocate change that benefits you and your community, even if that is very transformative change. I mean, obviously the founding fathers themselves were extremely hypocritical in their own policies, and directly so. Obviously, the founding fathers wanted to set up a government that was weighted towards the rich and the powerful, that excluded slaves, excluded most poor people, and excluded women, and certainly excluded and exterminated Native Americans. But they did say that people have the right to change their government if the governed do not consent to being governed by the existing rulers. And of course, many conservative people over the years have done that. But what the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement in particular, when a lot of the major cases around free speech happened, that this is what I think most people accept, said that, you know, you cannot be criminalized for what you think and what you say. And if the governed do not consent to being governed by the ruling elite, they should be able to speak out and say, we think the system should change. So don't self-censor yourself, because this is why we have these rights. That even up to saying we need a revolution in this country, and that just means having a change that means that instead of profit first, we're people first, that the real violence of millions of people into homelessness, millions of people losing their jobs, millions of people without health care or barely able to afford health care, millions of people who are dying of totally preventable diseases because they don't have money, people who are being foreclosed on, the wars that are happening around the world that are not only killing millions of people, that have spent trillions of dollars. Like, the real violence in the world today needs to stop, and that we need to have a beloved community, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, where everyone has their basic rights guaranteed, because we have enough to provide for everyone, not just to survive, but to thrive in our society, and that we need to change the government in a transformative way and have new systems and structures that allow us to be people first, not profit first. Like, that's what a revolution means. They want you to make it think, you know, it's hanging people from street lamps. That's not real. What it really is people trying to change to improve their material circumstances for the better, to stop the real violence that is being done against working class and oppressive people by the tiny elite in this country. That you have that right. That's why we have an expansive free speech right. That is allegedly what they say the country is all about. But as you self-censor yourself, then you're basically suggesting that they are right, that people do not have the right to demand that they should have a better life, that they do not have the right to say that there is a different way of doing things than the violence of capitalism, that there is a very actually peaceful and solidaristic way that we could live amongst each other, and we should move towards that system. And in fact, we are the ones who want to move towards that system entirely peacefully. Historically, you know, it's not the slaves that said we want to have violence against slavery. They said, can you please just let us free? And it was the slave owners who said, no, like, we'll never do that, and we'll murder you, and we'll kill you, and we'll crush you. It's always the oppressors and the exploiters who, when people peacefully say, hey, can we just have a slightly better life? They say, no, we'll kill you, we'll crush you, we'll destroy you, we'll imprison you, you will stop your right to speech. All these different sorts of things. That is the real violence, and they are the true perpetrators. And that is what they are trying to confuse, and that is why they're trying to scare people into not talking, because it's not about violence and disruption and chaos and all these other things. It's about people organizing to have a better life without racism, without poverty, without all these terrible things like war that are going on around the world. Like, this is what people are trying to do, that the Trump administration is trying to stop. And they're trying to create this totally false image. And they're also totally abrogating the history of how social change has happened in this country, and who were the real perpetrators of the violence, and who were the people who were defending themselves historically, to create a totally fake reality. So people have to recognize this. We have to speak out. We have to talk about it. We have to historicize it, because this is an important part of our legacy and our history, especially from the civil rights movement, where a lot of these free speech cases and the anti-Vietnam War movement were actually waged around what we can advocate in these great periods of social change that most people view very favorably and positively, because many of the rights we have, social, economic, and political, flow from that period.
Indeed. And I think it's important to emphasize this. There's two elements that I want to just highlight, Eugene. One is the real goal of the Trump administration is using all of these arguments, as you said, as a pretext to do something that they want to achieve, which is to basically permanently get rid of the civil rights reforms, the changes in American democracy that flowed from the labor movement and then later the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, the disabled movement, all of these expansions of democracy that we now, in a way, took for granted. And the ruling class, or some sector of the ruling class, wants to get rid of that. This is the Project 2025 sector. So that's one thing. And then the other part is the falsity of their argument. The United States is a very violent country. There is an epidemic of violence going on in the country, but it doesn't come from the left. I mean, if you look around the streets of the United States right now, you see masked, armed men, and some women, but mainly men, carrying out a reign of terror against a part of the U.S. working class, those who are foreign-born, the immigrant population, and their communities, and the children in those communities. There is a reign of terror going on. People are being kidnapped, violently kidnapped from their workplace, from their homes, from Home Depot parking lots. That's happening. And then the other element is the nonstop violence perpetrated against especially Black and Latino communities by police officers, like the cop who killed George Floyd. And then there's the longer history where you think about the United States. If you have a system where the proletariat, the working class, a big part of it are enslaved people, and that lasts for 3 centuries, or at least 2.5 centuries, that system can only be in place by virtue of violence. In other words, there's no way to keep people enslaved except by surrounding them with armed force. So it's a system that is built on violence. And then you had as we all know, the genocide against the original inhabitants of North America, the indigenous people. I mean, there is all of this violence, and yet the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, these right-wing semi-fascist, and some of them are just outright fascist elements, are creating this narrative that Black civil rights was something that was negative, that DEI, which is a stand-in for civil rights, has to be eliminated, that the imagery of enslaved people and the brutality visited upon them in the Smithsonian or other national museums, that has to be ripped out. Like, they have to change this entire narrative about the real perpetrators of institutional, collective, social, and much individual violence against oppressed sectors of society. And so it's really Alice in Wonderland. It is a violent country, but it's not the people who are being targeted as the violent perpetrators who are actually perpetrating the violence. It's the people who are attacking them. So this is part of the big project that we have to undertake. And as you said, Eugene, because the underlying policies of the Trump elite capitalist ultra-billionaire agenda are so unpopular, they're trying to shut people down, divide people, or scare people. And right now, as we go into this next period, I think we have to outline a strategy to fight back and to win. In other words, to not think that these people, just because they're talking tough, because they're using laws to intimidate people or criminalize people or demonize people, they don't have to win. We can stop them. It's different in different periods in American history. Like, I don't think the left could have really stopped the McCarthy era in 1950 because it was a byproduct of a different set of circumstances. But I actually think the left, the progressive forces, and anybody who believes in justice, by uniting into a strong mass movement, we can actually win this. Anyway, I want to get your take on that.
No, I think that's 100% true. And just a quick non sequitur about the point you make about the falsity of history and what they're saying. I mean, these are people who proudly embrace themselves as the America First movement. Well, the two entities that embraced America First the most broadly, first was the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s at the height of their power. And then secondly was the America First Committee during the 1930s, which were essentially Nazi sympathizers in the United States. It might be a little bit more complicated than that, but not that much. And many of them were openly sympathizing with Hitler. And that's why they were part of this America First, don't get involved in the war. But, you know, in the era of political consultants and all these different things, if you just feel like it's not a problem for you to be directly connected to the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi adjacent individuals, it sort of feels like that tells me all I really need to know about you and your political movement and what you're pushing and why it is such a narrow movement that most people in this country are not going to support, because most people in this country do not want to be associated with the Ku Klux Klan, the Nazis, or anything close to that kind of agenda, be it, you know, foreign or domestic. People do not want that. And I think that point you're making is very true. I mean, the McCarthy era, you know, it was about securing a rising capitalist imperialist leadership for the United States in the world and domestically, which required a certain, you know, destruction of progressive organizations in this country that, again, were not breaking any laws whatsoever. I mean, these people were not breaking laws organizationally. It was millions of people who were just, you know, for unions, for civil rights, all these other things. But they certainly were not for this 100% American century pro-capitalist agenda. Many of them thought there should be a more anti-colonial reality. But the point I'm making here is it was also attached to sort of a rising prosperity in the United States for some people, not for everyone, but for enough people that it was significant. So even though it wasn't the world's most popular thing, even then there were people who were speaking out, and more than you might think. You know, by and large, it is much easier to establish a sort of broader agenda around a broader subset of support around this sort of witch hunt type atmosphere, because it seemed like, you know, the sort of peace and prosperity that people wanted after the Second World War was at risk from these maligned people. Wasn't true, but easier to build that kind of bipartisan agenda. I think you can say the same thing about COINTELPRO, which is, you know, a different reality, but, you know, was being sort of perpetrated as a very, you know, significant system of segregation and other forms of running the country was collapsing, which meant that there was a lot of sort of shifting of the deck chairs on the ship, as it were, which meant that, again, you could create more of a broader constituency of people. Many of them, unfortunately, I think, confused about what was really going on, but thinking that they had some stake in the maintenance of this racist system. And in many ways, they did have a stake, but it certainly wasn't the stake they thought it was. And in fact, had they allied more directly with the civil rights movement, they would have had even more. But nonetheless, you could build a more bipartisan agenda around these kind of crackdowns and different things like that. But now this is totally different, I think, in this current era. I mean, this is obviously on almost every issue, if you look from Trump's approval rating to the issues themselves, you know, poll after poll after poll, even though polls are just snapshots in time, you can see that this broad agenda is not popular. And even insofar as things are popular, like there are a lot of people who, you know, the Trump administration and their friends will show these polls saying, well, people are really concerned about crime. And there are a lot of people concerned about crime. But then when you ask, like, are you for the National Guard coming in? People are not for that. So even in the areas where they are speaking to things that people care about, the actual solutions they're presenting are not that popular. This is an extreme agenda that people know. People have a sense that there is something wrong in this country, that there's something deeply malign, that things need to change, that the rich and the powerful have, you know, way too much power in this country, and that they're using it for themselves at the expense of other people. That, you know, ultimately, when you look at it, again, across the board, you can see that these things are not popular. So ultimately, at the end of the day, that creates a lot of space. And again, just to go back to the theme we've been putting forward, this is why they want to shut people up. I mean, broad transformative change in this country is something neither major political party wants. That we know, and there's no doubt about that. And there are some things that, you know, that's why under Republicans and Democrats, the minimum wage federally is still at $7.25 an hour. So there are some things that are rooted in our capitalist order that we would need to have a people-first socialist order to change. But that is not the Trump agenda. The Trump agenda is trying to establish a really kind of totally different way, in a quote unquote modern sense, of organizing the country. One that says what happened in the civil rights movement, what happened in the New Deal, what happened even in the quote unquote progressive era. Because don't forget, Trump is always talking about the 1890s in the Gilded Age. That's not an accident. Like, he is essentially saying, and his agenda is basically like, we want to go back to a time where corporations had no regulation, where workers had no rights whatsoever, and we're almost all living in complete abject poverty, where there is no significant infrastructure to protect the civil rights that people have under the 14th Amendment, where there is no significant protections of voting rights that people have under the 15th Amendment, where the rights of women are completely and totally eroded, where things like the Americans Disability Act is gone, that the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is rolled back to the Ku Klux Klan era immigration approach of 1924, that the LGBTQ community has to go back not just into the closet, but into a closet that's going to be put in a basement, and then they're going to dig a dozen sub-basements and then go down in there too, so that no one knows you even exist and don't dare say anything in any way, shape, or form. Like, that's what they want to go back to. So it's not just like, and it's not really an issue of capitalism versus socialism with the Trump agenda. And that's why they're also targeting the Ford Foundation and Soros and these other people who are capitalists, who are for capitalism and are for a certain level, and in some cases a significant level of inequality and different things like that they just think go along with the system. But even they are not radical enough for the Trump agenda. So they want to take people and shut them up. They want to have this very narrow agenda that's so narrow and so unpopular that just by exercising basic democratic rights to vote, to petition, to form unions, to strike, all these different things, to speak out, to have media programs, to be able to say what you want on the airwaves, that those things are enough to unite enough people to derail this agenda, because it's such a minoritarian agenda. But that means we can win. They are in fact afraid. They want to shut people up. They don't need a fear of anything just beyond that, because they know that this is so unpopular that even just the most basic democratic rights can get there. So we have to understand the nature of how extreme and how radical the sort of Trump agenda and program is, to understand the possibility of using our democratic constitutional rights to actually derail the Trump agenda, and put that in its appropriate context about the type of society that it would take us back to, that in and of itself was not sufficient. Like, of course, when Obama was the president, it was nothing like this, but we know society was not sufficient for the average working class and oppressed person, and they still faced way too many challenges, problems, premature deaths, and terrible living standards that are a result of capitalism that neither party wants to change. But this is not about that specifically. This is about shutting people up, erasing civil rights, erasing workers' rights, erasing regulation in every single type of way, going back to an 1890s Gilded Age robber baron existence where they can just run over everyone like a steamroller, and that's so unpopular that even Jimmy Kimmel on ABC is an abject threat to them. Like, that's how unpopular they are, that is a threat to them, that voting is a threat to them, that petitioning is a threat to them, that demonstrating is a threat to them, even when it's all 100% legal and peaceful. So that's why they're going after people like this. But of course, since it's so unpopular, nobody's going to be for that. Like, you know, if you just say, hey, we're going after people because like they have ideas I don't like. Well, I mean, you know, even I think a lot of Trump supporters are going to be like, well, damn, like, that don't sound that good. So they have to turn it into like, well, we're going after these people who have bad ideas because those bad ideas are violent and terroristic. And then people say, oh, well, we don't want violence. We don't want terrorism. We don't want people to die. So like, maybe we should crack down on them. So it's about creating a totally fake narrative in order to do something deeply malign, which is to stop totally legal, totally democratic, written down in law, fought for and extended by movements that everyone respects, you know, from Martin Luther King on down. And that's why they want to stop it. And they have to create this fake violence around that.
Yeah, that's so important. And I want to, as we get towards the end, Eugene, I want to highlight one or two of the things that you pointed out and get your final thoughts on it. So in addition to going after left forces like ourselves, like socialist forces, like people who are, you know, radically oriented, meaning that we want a radical transformation. We're sick of capitalism. We want a system based on equality, or we want a socialist system. In addition to targeting them, you're also the Trump administration is targeting the Rockefeller Fund, the George Soros Foundation supported groups, the Ford Foundation, Jimmy Kimmel and ABC. Before that, they went after the universities like Harvard and Columbia and other even elite Ivy League schools that are not left at all, not even liberal really, many of them. They went after the media organizations. Trump was suing the New York Times, suing the Wall Street Journal. They went after major corporate law firms in Washington, D.C., demanding that, and many of them capitulated and agreed to do pro bono work in the hundreds of millions of dollars for the Trump administration's right-wing agenda. They went after like all of these liberal sectors of American capitalism, and they're going after them. And it goes back to the point that you and I talked about way back when Trump was first elected, that the Project 2025 agenda, which has been sort of in the background through the Federalist Society trying to stack courts, or ALEC trying to, reorient state legislatures in a very right-wing, pro-capitalist direction, get rid of any environmental protections, etc. That with the ascendancy of the Trump White House, they felt this right-wing sector, these ultra-rightists, semi-fascistic wing of the ruling class, felt that they had a mass base now because Trump is a popular politician. And now they could go for it. This was their moment. So they're going after all of these sectors, not just the radical left, not just the socialists. And it shows that the real goal by a section of the American capitalist bourgeoisie is to undo their own system and replace it with a kind of right-wing political dictatorship, a semi-fascistic right-wing political dictatorship, because, and this is my fundamental point, they know that their system is not working. They know that this system is failing. And they also know they have more class consciousness in some ways than our movement. They know that we could basically create a mass movement for social change and social justice such that it could lead to radical transformation. And that's the thing that they really fear. In other words, it's predicated on fear based on a failing system. And it doesn't mean that they won't succeed. The question of whether they succeed really depends on us. It really depends on the people. It really depends on whether people don't self-censor, whether people organize, whether we have an affirming, positive, go-forward plan. I feel very optimistic that we can win, but we have to also realize the seriousness of the moment, because these people who have lots of power within a section of the bourgeoisie, they are going for it. This is an epic battle for democratic rights. Anyway, with that said, I give you the last word.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, and if you remember, many people remember this in the context of the transition into the Trump administration. A lot of these, big Trump influencers were saying stuff like, we only got 2 years. We only got 2 years, because they recognize that what they want to do is so unpopular that the chances of them losing the midterms in 2026 was basically assured. It happens pretty regularly that the president's party loses, but it's just sort of an amazing statement that before the president even was taking office, many of his most prominent supporters in the sort of online sphere are basically saying what we're doing is not popular. And so if we don't get as much done as we possibly can in 2 years, then it's basically going to be over for us. And I think it's probably worse than they expected, because we're only 9 months in and just about every major Trump policy is looking terrible. I mean, this is the guy who says he's going to bring down prices, and you've got electricity going up 6.2% year on year from the most recent thing. You've got beef going up like crazy. You've got the cost of rent that's going up. You've got food away from home is going up substantially. And I always like to point that one out, because you got all these other problems. Your electricity's going up. Your rent is going up, the transportation costs are going up, all these different things are going up. And sometimes maybe you just want to escape and get away and hang out with your friends. Can't even do that because that's going up. So, they're destroying people's quality of life across the board in almost every possible way. The tariffs are not bringing back jobs. In fact, you see a lot of these big corporations are actually cutting jobs in the context of what's happening right now. The economy is becoming, weak in many different ways. People's incomes and wages that haven't been keeping up for 50 years are still not keeping up for 50 years. The cost of healthcare probably likely to skyrocket. Tens of millions of people are about to get kicked off, or I don't know if it's tens of millions, millions of people are going to get kicked off of healthcare. And everyone talking about the one big beautiful bill, but you have to remember that the context of what's happening with the potential government shutdown is the rest of the budget. That was not the majority of the budget. So they actually are still planning to make even deeper cuts, not just food stamps, not just Medicaid. They're going to be cutting rental assistance. They're going to be cutting every possible thing that helps anyone in any way, shape, or form reform, and none of the little gimmicks they're doing in the tax code are going to actually restore people's income. And almost every single significant study done on this say that people are going to be losing, on average, $1,500, $1,700, $2,000. And when it's on average, that means some people will be losing thousands of dollars, but no one can afford to lose anything that's not a billionaire or a millionaire at this point in time. So this agenda and everything they are doing is tanking. It was unpopular to start with, but it's even more unpopular because the way that they are rolling it out is just nothing like what they said. I mean, I think there were a fair amount of people who supported Trump who are, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's even the majority, who are basically good people who were willing to roll the dice on this guy and give him a chance. And even those people, I think a lot of them are seeing, that's why Trump has a 39% approval rating. You know what I mean? Is that even a lot of people are like, I'm gonna give the guy a chance, are like, well, wait, this is not working out. So ultimately, they recognize that they are in a position that we could build a mass movement to stop them, because again, what they are doing is so extreme. Like, their agenda is the radical agenda, this Project 2025 agenda. It is so extreme that it actually it takes a lot in the sense of the work we have to do to organize, but it doesn't take that much. Like, you can, to go back to the 1890s, like, so few people are for going back to the 1890s. Like, people just got to think about this. We're talking about child labor. And let's remember, there's people like Mike Lee, by the way, the Trumpist senator from Utah, who's said he wants to loosen child labor laws. And you have these deep red states that are trying to do it. We're going back to before women had the right to vote. We're going back before there was an income tax of any way, shape, or form. We're going back to before civil rights. That would be going back to before unions. I mean, like, this is when Trump is constantly saying 1890s, Gilded Age type robber baron era. Like, it's called the Gilded Age, but it also became known as the robber baron era for an exact reason. And that is what Trump would not just be randomly referencing this over and over again. That is the agenda of Project 2025, is to roll back, essentially, as much as they can, the totality of social, economic, and political changes that help the working classes and the so-called middle classes that have come in since 1900, not 1960, not 1930, since 1900. So, I mean, like, that's going back to Upton Sinclair and the jungle and horse meat, in the stores and all these different things. I mean, it's unbelievable. So to stop that, you can vote that out. You can demonstrate that out. You can petition that out. Like, you can build a mass democratic movement under the Constitution of the rights that you have under the umbrella that has been created by these progressive movements since 1900 and going back to Reconstruction. Like, under just those rules alone, you can get rid of that. Now, to do more than that, like to have housing for everyone, clothing for everyone, food for everyone, you need to have more transformative change to be people first, not profit first, which means you need socialism and not capitalism. But we have free speech rights specifically so that people can say, we do not consent to be governed in a society where there's abundance for everyone, but there's still scarcity in reality because of a few handful of people. We have the right to speak out against that. So we have the ability under our democratic rights to do two things. One, to organize people under the basics of what has been done to make change under this system before, which is totally legal and totally legitimate, to eliminate this far-right pro-Trump movement by uniting the broad forces that they're trying to destroy, who see this Project 2025 referendum as malign. And we also have the rights under our First Amendment right in this country to say that that also won't be enough for working class and oppressed people in America. We need deeper changes to happen in this country, transformative changes to happen in this country, people first over profit first mentality, and we can start to organize people around this kind of understanding of what our future can be and should be moving forward. We have those rights. We have the right and the ability to build a mass democratic movement that can stop Trump and can stop this ultra-right, ultra-pro-capitalist, anti-working class agenda. And we have the rights to say that that is not enough and we need to do more for everyone to not be able to just survive, but to thrive in a society that exists in abundance in the United States and around the world. And they want to shut us up and shut that down because they know it's not illegal, that it's not connected to any form of violence or anything like that, and that in fact it's something that the broad majority of people, including many Republicans and Trump supporters, in terms of the actual goals of the policies we're saying should be put in place, will get behind and will support. Certainly a majority of the country overall.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Eugene Puryear, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.